Our thanks to Edwin Dean and Sandy Long for recruiting these new members. Upcoming programs. Friday, January the 11th, if you're having trouble sleeping, this is the place to be. Dr. William Dimmitt, Director of the Sleep Disorders Clinic and Laboratory at Stanford University School of Medicine, will shed new light on the causes and cures of one of the nation's most widespread and troublesome problems. He will explore the effects of sleeplessness on the workplace and family relationships. We'll be here at the Portland Hilton. The following Friday, January 18th, Winston Ndugani, canon in the Episcopal Church of South Africa, will be with us. He's the chief assistant to Bishop Desmond Tutu, and he'll speak on South Africa, the way ahead. We'll be back here at the Portland Hilton. I'm delighted to announce that our leadership training course, Pathways to Leadership, is full. We have no more space, and we're pleased that it has filled up. As you remember, this course is based on Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That's not true, though, for our City Club Merrillhurst course. We still have a couple of spots left in it. It's entitled Discourses in Public Affairs, Issues and Answers, and will begin January the 11th. As you remember, State Representative Mike Burton, who's also assistant to the president at Merrillhurst, and John Sinclair, chairman of the Department of Humanities, jointly facilitate this course, which features students coming to our Friday programs and then retiring to the City Club office, where some of our speakers join them to explore the issue of the day in depth. If you're interested in signing up for this course, and by the way, you can get both graduate and undergraduate credit for it, you should call the Student Services Office at Merrillhurst. That telephone number is 636-8141. Today, our board host seated at the head table is Jim Westwood, president-elect of the club, and an attorney with Miller, Nash, Weiner, Hager, and Carlson. He has the privilege of asking the first question. The second question from the floor today will be by Alan Hunt, who is the chair of our Human Services Standing Committee. As usual, we will open to questions from City Club members after our speakers' remarks. We do give preference to those people who go to the mic, but if you have a written question you'd like to submit, please fill out one of the forms that's on the table, hold it up, and one of the City Club staff members will pick it up after the speech. Now for our program. Each new year, we're treated to a list of what's in and what's out. This year I read that minivans are out, expensive restaurant meals are out, as is workaholism. Politically, property taxes are out, which has opened the door for a lot of speculation of what the in tax is going to be. Will it be a sales tax, a user fee, or a yet unknown creative replacement tax? For sure, this legislative session is going to discuss every possible avenue to balance our budget. And if you read the Oregonian this morning, you probably heard that they're even taking a peek at possibly reducing basic school support. What's in holds a fascination for us. And our speaker today may be called an inside outsider. He has 20 years experience as a political journalist, and he's beginning his 10th legislative session as a reporter. Russell Sadler's daily commentaries have appeared on radio and television in Oregon and Southwest Washington. His newspaper columns have appeared in the Oregonian, the Seattle Times, the LA Times, and the New York Times. And then in his spare time, just to round things out, he sometimes serves as an adjunct assistant professor of journalism at the University of Oregon and Pacific University. Mr. Sadler makes his 7th, I believe, visit to the podium of City Club today, to give us another lively and provocative glimpse into politics. His interpretation of Ballot Measure 5 is bound to stir the imagination as well as the ins and outs. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Sadler.
Thank you, Mrs. Kramer. That's the most recent introduction I've had. It's true, I graduated from the University of Oregon with a Bachelor of Science degree. We abbreviate that a BS degree. If you don't know what that means, you will in about 20 minutes. I have another academic credential. I'm a graduate of the Dan Quayle School of Tact and Diplomacy. Surely you remember former Senator Quayle. He's the fellow who taught us never offend someone with substance when you can offend them with style. Actually, I understand Dan Quayle thinks Roe versus Wade is 2 ways to cross the Potomac. Why is it that I always get a better laugh from the women than the men in the audience on that line? And I'm pleased to observe that the City Club continues its long-standing policy of not paying speakers. It's admirable, actually. After all, it is only money, and you can't take it with you. I know. I have a friend who tried. She sent some on ahead. It came back with a note. The note read, "You ain't coming here." In the 20 years I've been covering politics, I've stumbled across a few eternal verities I've taken the liberty of codifying as Russell's rules. Russell's rule, the first, holds that people who live in glass houses are better dressed at breakfast than the rest of us. Russell's rule, the second, holds in politics, no good deed goes unpunished. If you doubt me, just ask Attorney General Frohnmeyer. If you watch television, you'll recognize Russell's rule, the third. Pure drivel drives ordinary drivel off the evening newscast. And Russell's rule, the fourth, will be familiar to anyone in business or politics. Whatever hits the fan will not be distributed evenly. Actually, there are a lot of these laws. They give you great insight into the people for whom they're named. There's Coolidge's law. Coolidge's law holds when large numbers of people are out of work, it can lead to unemployment. Now, he actually said that while he was president. Then there's Berra's law, named after that distinguished New York philosopher, Yogi Berra. Berra's law holds you can observe a lot just by watching. Then there's Allen's law, named after that distinguished Manhattan philosopher, Woody Allen. Allen's law holds the lion and the calf shall lie down together, but the calf won't get much sleep. Then there's Lisa's law, named after my wife. Lisa's law holds if you want warm, fuzzy things in your life, you have to be willing to clean the cat box. Cat owners over here, I can see that right now, yes. Then there is Wells' law. Wells' law holds parades should have bands or horses, but not both. Wells was a drum majorette. And lastly, there is Nixon's principle, named after our former president. Nixon's principle holds, if 2 wrongs don't make a right, try 3. Well, despite all the election promises and the shrieking rhetoric, Ballot Measure 5 is neither the end of the known world nor the savior of the taxpayer. Ballot Measure 5 is a shift, not a gift, with winners and losers, as all Oregonians are about to find out. Many Oregonians will not feel any effect from Ballot Measure 5 for the first year or two. Many property owners will get their tax bills next fall, and indeed will wonder what all this fuss was all about. Their tax bills will hardly change at all, because their property is in a tax code area where school and local government taxes are already below the limits set in Measure 5. Others will get their tax bill, particularly farmers, and find their tax bill has actually gone up, because the limit in Measure 5 applies to a new term called real market value, not the production value that farms are assessed at now. These folks are among the losers. The undisputed winners of Measure 5's new limits are the business and commercial property owners who pay 58% of all the property taxes in this state and who will get 58 cents out of every dollar saved. The 5 biggest classes of property owners, gas utilities, electric utilities, telephone utilities, and industrial timberland owners, will get so much money that their owners may well take their tax savings out of the state if the Oregon economy doesn't justify the reinvestment of sums so large. The biggest losers, of course, are the Oregonians who will have to pungle up the money to replace the business property tax revenue with either state income tax dollars or potentially a new sales tax. Either way, Measure 5 narrows the tax base, forcing fewer people to pay more for the same or less services. Even those Oregonians who get immediate property tax relief will find they are losers, because lower property taxes will reduce the deductions from their federal income taxes, increasing the money that we send out of state to a beneficent Congress. Many of these same people will then pay more in state income taxes or a sales tax to replace the lost property taxes for schools and local governments. Measure 5 has assured that Oregon will now abandon locally financed schools for centrally financed schools. The measure is supposed to make schools look at their priorities, tighten their belts, and spend less money. It's not going to happen. Instead, it is more likely to raise the cost of schools. Oregonians will find that centrally financed schools are going to cost more than the sum of the present 306 individual school district levies. Why is that? Because the legislature will learn, as it struggles to set a uniform level of school support throughout the state, that the levels of support in Grants Pass and Josephine County are not acceptable anywhere else. And patrons of high-cost school districts like Beaverton, like Oswego, Corvallis, Eugene, Helix, and Crane will not accept anything resembling some mythical statewide average. Money may not mean everything, but the difference between education in Grants Pass and Beaverton is money, pure and simple. Parents who have been willing to tax themselves to spend money on their children in districts with effective education programs are simply not going to accept major budget reductions jeopardize their children's education by large increases in class size. As a result, state-set school spending levels will be closer to the higher-cost districts than the lower-cost districts, and that will require more tax money than the sum of the present 306 levies. The additional money is either going to come from increased income taxes, a new sales tax, or cuts in present state programs that are funded by income tax revenue. Conventional wisdom has it that Ballot Measure 5 passed because Oregonians were mad as hell at the legislature's inaction and just not taking it anymore. Well, it turns out the conventional wisdom was wrong. That is the startling result of analyzing the election returns. Ballot Measure 5 passed in just 14 of Oregon's 36 counties. Ballot Measure 5 passed by 42,000 votes, a majority of 42,000 out of 1 million votes cast. Only Wasco County in all of eastern Oregon passed Measure 5. Only Jackson County in all of southwestern Oregon passed Measure 5. All the rest of the counties voting for Measure 5 are west of the Cascades and north of a line between Albany and Newport. Portland and its playgrounds. This is the most prosperous part of the state. This is the revolt of the haves who no longer wish to pay the costs of growth that they have produced for themselves. Oregonians are about to learn that Measure 5's new limits are no longer subject to local voting. Oregonians may no longer determine the level of spending they want for their schools and cities and counties. These decisions will now be made in Salem, because people who wrote Ballot Measure 5 did not want local voters to have the freedom to determine their own level of taxation. Now, there may well be an argument for setting a uniform statewide level of school support in Salem. Voters in a few school districts have shamefully abused local control to reduce taxes at the expense of the next generation for years now. Josephine County is the principal example. And if the legislature is expected to come up with replacement revenue for local property taxes, the legislature, understandably, will want to control how its money is spent. But there is no sane reason for requiring cities and counties to come to Salem with their begging bowls for money to finance services once financed by property taxes. We already do that with loot from the lottery, and frankly, outside the Portland metropolitan area, the pickings from that pork barrel have been pretty lean. Oregon will not be saved from Salem. The Oregon economy will not be diversified by Salem bureaucrats doling out dollars. The Oregon economy will be saved one community at a time with local partnerships of public and private money. There are plenty of success stories already. Bend and Bandon and Brookings and Newport, just to mention my favorites. The 117 cities out of the 242 in Oregon that did not vote for Measure 5 have now lost much of their autonomy. While Measure 5 exempts bond payments, staffing new facilities from libraries to fire halls to convention halls can only come at the expense of fewer police or firemen or public works employees, given the lid that has been imposed on all of local government. When the geographic majority of Oregon rejected Measure 5, these people knew their autonomy was at stake. Do not be surprised this session if you see Oregonians in the 22 counties that did not vote for Measure 5 demanding a local option constitutional amendment in an effort to get their autonomy back. They will have some allies in their cause, because even in the Portland area, there is growing concern that amending the Oregon Constitution, and that is what Measure 5 did, has become a mere popularity contest. Repeal of constitutional standards we have long taken for granted, the right to keep and bear arms, protection from search and seizure, even the right to speak freely on any subject whatever, is now just a majority vote away. Portland Representative Tom Mason and the Interim Judiciary Committee have produced a bill requiring a 2/3 majority vote on any future state constitutional amendments. The ACLU, the self-appointed public arbiter of the propriety of such things, has announced it will oppose a 2/3 majority for any constitutional amendments because it violates one person, one vote. Well, the ACLU should recall that amending the U.S. Constitution still requires ratification by 3/4 of the states. Population was more evenly distributed in Oregon in 1902 when this state adopted the initiative and referendum. It was not possible then for one population center in the state to impose its will on the rest of the state as it can now. Now, we, in what has come to be termed the other Oregon, have resigned ourselves to having governors of Portland. 3 or 4 in a row has been now. That is majority rule after all. Statutory initiatives can be changed by the legislature if they are regionally onerous. But allowing a geographic minority of the state to take away constitutional rights like local autonomy from the geographic majority by a bare numerical superiority ought not to be allowed to happen again. Constitutional rights that apply to us all must not be repealed by a bare majority of voters who bother to show up at the polls on a given day. We should require that initiatives amending the Oregon Constitution be approved by a majority in each congressional district, or perhaps pass in 3/4 of Oregon's 36 counties, assuring widespread support for changes in constitutional direction. All this chaos around Measure 5, and you have not even seen much of it publicly yet. It is going to get worse before it gets better, because all the definitions in Oregon tax law now have to be changed to comply with Measure 5. And this is where all the unintended effects and rude surprises are occurring. But all this chaos reminds me of the late U.S. House Speaker Sam Rayburn's famous line, "Any jackass can kick down a barn. It takes a carpenter to build one. Don McIntyre and Tom Dennehy are no carpenters. Measure 5 is a bit like the Ducks football team. Out in front of the whole nation, we snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. You see, the west coast of the United States is the way the world is going. 3/4 of all the people in our nation who live west of Denver live in a strip 120 miles wide along Interstate 5, the Pacific Slope. There is a measured growth and prosperity here if we make the necessary accommodations to attract it. That is indeed what many parts of the state were doing in the 1970s, and a lot of plans and ambitions went on hold during the recession of the 1980s. And just as we begin to think that the Oregon economy is moving again, community by community, we go and pass Measure 5 and cripple our ability to make the public investments that are the economic prerequisites for the private investment that drives our economy. The history of the economy of the western states shows that public investment precedes private investment. From the government-financed expedition of Lewis and Clark, to the government forts along the Oregon Trail, to the government land grants that collateralized the building of the western railroads, to the dams built to counter the Depression, to the industrial capacity built during World War II, public investment came first. Private investors followed. Why is that important? Because public capital investment in Oregon has declined 40% in the 1980s. We are no longer keeping pace with our capital needs, much less our maintenance and repair. There is a $154 million backlog of maintenance and code violations on the Oregon State University campus. There is a $57 million maintenance backlog at the University of Oregon. The backlog of maintenance in our state parks amounts to tens of millions of dollars. At a time when the Oregon economy is shifting from brawn power to brain power, the legislature, in its wisdom, put an enrollment cap on the state's universities so that it could find money under the spending limit to hire guards for new prisons. Now, I agree with those who say we can't afford everything and we ought to set some priorities, but those are choices we ought not to be asked to make. More and more, the state's limited general fund budget is going to finance people who will never amount to anything at the expense of those who almost certainly will. In the 1990s, half the faculty at Oregon and Oregon State will retire. Just a demographic fact. Right now, we cannot afford to replace those who retire with people of equal stature. They are most often replaced by beginners. We hope those people are tomorrow's stars, but frankly, their future is uncertain. They will teach your children. Don Frisbee, the chairman of Pacific Corp and chairman of the Governor's Committee on Higher Education in the Portland area, said, "If we cannot get quality engineering programs into the Portland area, we might as well go back to the next century." Welcome to 1890, Don. New academic programs in Portland today will only come at the expense of cannibalizing programs on other campuses in the state. It is the result of the spending lid and Ballot Measure 5. If you are tired, and I see some shaking heads in here, if you are tired of one step forward and two steps back, that seems to be the Oregon two-step, many of your elected officials are not. Governor-elect Barbara Roberts says Oregon must endure a period of pain. House Speaker-designate Larry Campbell starts his speeches these days by saying, Oregonians voted for pain. Outside Portland, even in Campbell's district, I hear quiet voices murmuring, "What do you mean we, Kimosabe?" It turns out that the property tax problem was a Portland metropolitan problem. Now, if Portland wants to spend time arguing over pain, that is its business. You do indeed have problems. I lived here for 12 years. The Portland area simply has too much government. I have a brief prescription. eliminate 3 counties, give regional responsibilities to Metro, governed by a professional administrator appointed by the Metro Council, and chuck Portland's obsolete commissioner arrangement and adopt a council-manager form of government. That ought to cause... That ought to cause plenty of pain. The rest of the state, for our part, would like the option of repealing Measure 5 so we can go on with the business that matters to us. And I assure you, you will hear that when the legislature convenes. We will ask for a constitutional local option amendment that allows people city by city and county by county to return to the old system. I think it has a good chance of passing in all of eastern Oregon and most of southwestern Oregon. I hear a great deal of buyer's remorse these days. And we should, because Ballot Measure 5 is a bit like smashing your computer in a temper tantrum and sitting down and wondering how you're going to plug all the dangling wires back together again. Too late, damage is done. It's an exercise in futility. Now, Portland and northwestern Oregon had its temper tantrum in November. We want Portland to deal with its growth problems. But the 1990s are no time for exercises in futility. We are making decisions, consciously or unconsciously, that will determine whether we will have an economy in this state like Germany or an economy like Poland. Will we be economically robust like Washington to the north, or will Oregon become the West Virginia of the West Coast? Measure 5 has already sent a powerful message to the young, capable, ambitious Oregonians. By passing Measure 5, we have told our children that we do not care about their future as much as our own economic security. We have demonstrated to them that we lack the patience and mature civic discipline to solve our problems without scapegoats and punishing the innocent. This is called eating your young. We have fashioned Measure 5 as a rod to beat ourselves with, and no one enjoys political sadomasochism like Oregonians do. While we flagellate ourselves in paroxysms of civic self-righteousness, other states are simply passing us by. We no longer lead in land use planning, environmental protection, highways, state parks, a balanced and fair tax system. All proud chapters in what the late Tom McCall once called the Oregon story. We no longer lead in education. As we talk about spending less, even lowly Mississippi, at the bottom of virtually every list, is spending more money on educating its children, not less. The victims of all of this, the young, do not rise up in angry criticism of the indulgence of their elders. They simply quietly leave the state and go elsewhere. Indeed, it has already begun. For the last 10 years, I've been interviewing seniors who won scholarships at some of the most prestigious out-of-state universities. 10 years ago, they used to regret going and were anxious to come back. They were afraid they were leaving something, that they might miss something. No more. Over the last 5 years, these seniors say they're glad to get out. Oregonians, they say, just can't get it together. They're always fighting. They can't seem to ever decide on anything. Hey, they've got our number. The drain brain, the surest sign of the road to West Virginia, has already begun. Oregon must decide, and decide quickly, whether we will continue to be the land of promise for the aspiring our legend has made us since the days of Lewis and Clark, or whether we will continue on the path of becoming a quiet backwater for the comfortably retired and retiring, with policies that encourage our best young people to leave for better social and economic opportunities. Do not kid yourselves, it's begun. Now you say, oh, Sadler, you're so cynical. Why don't you just get along and move and let us talk about Ballot Measure 5? We'll take care of that here. I came to Oregon 25 years ago with the permission of my late grandfather. who had imbued in us, all his grandchildren, a sense of civic responsibility. You owe something to the system that made life pretty good for you. My late grandfather, by the way, was a member of the City Club of Cleveland. As I grew up, that sense of duty became a burden. I was supposed to make a contribution. My father, who was self-employed all his life and whose self-employment discipline set a standard that I struggle to meet to this day, encouraged me to go into journalism. Maybe this was the place we could make a contribution. I worried about leaving Cleveland. My grandfather said, "Russell, go." Said, "Cleveland didn't take my advice. They've made their mistakes. All they'll do for your lifetime is damage control." Well, I now see myself where my grandfather was. This is probably the most serious misstep we have made in our 120-year-old experiment in self-government. We have lost what momentum we were gaining coming out of the recession, and there is every chance that the world will pass us by. We are not making the public investment that will attract the private investment that will enable us to take advantage of the economic growth on the Pacific Rim. Portlanders sit here and say, "Well, you know, Sadler, I'm not sure that's true. After all, we're doing pretty well." No, you only think you are. This economy is in a transition too. Not like the areas to the south and the east where the agricultural economy is undergoing its usual stresses and strains, and where the timber industry is in a transition from old growth to second growth production. Here in Portland, the local money is being bought out by the absentee money. And the power, the ability to decide your own fate, is moving from this town to distant boardrooms. I mean, that's been the history of the West, but we have less control over our destiny today because of things we are doing to ourselves than we have had in the entire post-World War II era. Now, I don't have children. This business with the schools is a theoretical exercise for me, except that I lecture to them a lot and I referee your sons and daughters in their soccer games, and that sort of thing. But it matters to me what happens to us. We have become smug and complacent. We have turned our backs on the next generation. That's not my opinion, that's theirs. That's the message they got out of this ballot measure. We don't have time for a period of pain. Oregonians did not vote for pain. Oregonians cannot blame the legislature for the irresolution of this problem. We have rejected at the polls all the alternatives they've put out. Pogo's famous comment is still true. Okay? Seeing the enemy is us. This is Oregon. This is where the people rule. We have not been making wise decisions. This club, with all its prestige and distinction, and it is, we have shamelessly copied you in Eugene, the new City Club of Eugene. We've just shamelessly copied you with the help of Nina Johnson and your staff. You need to help get the momentum back. Eliminate 3 counties, change the council to a council manager form of government. It eliminates a lot of overhead. In the larger scheme of dollars, it's not a lot of money, but as a gesture, it is terribly important. This area needs to be streamlined by somebody big enough to cross all those petty political jurisdictions. Please get out there and lead and do that. The rest of this state was a bit shocked by the election returns because we too were fooled by the conventional wisdom, you know. We were mad as hell and just not going to take it anymore. Turns out this is a metropolitan problem. We'd like to get out of it so we can move ahead. We do not have time for exercises in futility. Our economy has not reached the critical mass that the Portland metropolitan economy has reached. And indeed, in some places of the state, Coos Bay area, for example, things are genuinely desperate. Eastern Oregon has been losing population because they cannot provide a living for people who wish to live there. One community at a time. And we've just lost the means to do it. Well, when I was at the university, I had a speech professor who said at gatherings like this, it's my job to talk and your job to listen. I noticed that 2 or 3 of you have finished ahead of me. So we'll give these services the benediction, and thank you very much.
Jim Westwood, president-elect of the club, has the privilege of asking the first question. Jim?
Russ, I heard some people who I would consider to be semi-rational, at least after the election, saying, well, yeah, I voted for Measure 5 because, to use your own words, these legislators, no carpenters they, need a 2-by-4 between the eyes, and this will get them moving on some balanced sort of tax structure. I heard what you had to say about the dire effects of Ballot Measure 5, but looking at it from the standpoint of a legislature that's going to need to do something in order to build credibility, short of repealing Ballot Measure 5, what kind of a tax structure do you think is going to come out of this session?
Well, first of all, I don't think anything the legislature does will appease Don McIntyre or Tom Dennehy or anybody else. They like the role they're playing and will milk it to the end. They will oppose any tax program that comes out. There are only 3 ways to tax people. You tax what they earn, what they own, or what they spend. And most states are smart enough to get you by all 3 throats. We do not. We do not tax what people spend. For that reason, it has given us some economic advantages. We are the largest single seller and manufacturer of motorhomes on the face of the planet. Well, you buy a $400,000 motorhome and you don't have to pay a 7% sales tax. That represents a substantial savings. I'm not sure that that is worth preserving at the cost of our educational system. Over the 20 years I've covered the legislature, I have watched the tax base get narrower and narrower and narrower, mostly because the legislature, those nasty Democrats, have responded to the requests of business to reduce their tax. There is no more inheritance tax anymore. There is no more inventory tax. Any number, it was called the Meyer and Frank bill originally because it allowed the downtown Meyer and Frank to be taxed at its earnings value, its income value, rather than its highest and best use value. But that device is now being used everywhere from department stores to lumber mills, which of course are not particular money makers these days. So over the years, the tax burden has shifted away from business to residential owners. And as the costs of school have gone up, this has become an onerous burden. The consensus that taxing property was a fair way to finance your children's education has deteriorated. In fact, it's completely gone as fewer and fewer people have children. I mean, in Eugene, only 30% of the population has children in school. In Lincoln County, it's 20%. And there are other parts of the state where it's lower than that. There's simply no consensus anymore for pitting the older people who have retired and their economic security against the education of the next generation. There's only one way to resolve this. This is to broaden the tax base. You don't have to raise the rates. You don't have to adjust it. You can adjust these taxes so the state doesn't get appreciably much more money than it gets now. We simply have to spread the burden after 20 years of narrowing it to fewer and fewer people farther and farther. So, here's an axiom, because, you know, he who lives by the crystal ball learns to eat broken glass, Jim. I don't know what they're going to do, and I'm damned if I'm going to predict. But I will give you a little axiom here to judge their effort by. Any tax package that broadens the number of people paying taxes, even if it doesn't increase the dollars, is good. Any tax scheme that reduces the number of people paying taxes is detrimental and is likely to lead to further initiatives by the people who the burden shifts to free themselves of it. Measure 5 was the largest single tax shift in the last 50 years. Business and commercial property owners, most of them out-of-state owners, paid 58 cents of every dollar of property taxes paid in the state on a statewide average. They will now get 58 cents of every dollar saved and take the money where they will. This was not bright.
Alan Hunt, Chair of our Standing Committee on Human Services, has the privilege of asking the second question. Alan?
I appreciate you articulating so many of my feelings. I couldn't agree more with what you had to say, but there's something I'd like for you to comment and maybe expand upon. It seems to me this notion of the haves and the people who have already climbed to the top now turning their backs on our young, cannibalizing them, is not just an Oregon phenomenon. It's happening in our nation. And I wondered if you could kind of integrate or at least put into perspective what we're seeing here in the context of what we've seen across our country.
We're just a little late, Alan. It began with Proposition 13 and Proposition 1.5 in Massachusetts. People got tired of paying the bill, or what they perceived as the bill. I must tell you, Oregon has not been an expensive state in terms of taxes. Income taxes as a proportion of tax revenue is quite high. Property taxes as a proportion of tax revenue is quite high if you rank us nationally. But per capita taxes paid in this state run from 22 to 27th, depending on what year you calculated the figures. We've never been any higher than 22nd and never any lower than 27th. These are usually figures that come out of the Commerce Department and appear in as proprietary information in all these business climate consulting reports. There's quite a racket in that goes on. Okay. We have not particularly been a high tax state. We have been a high service state. We have squeezed a lot out of the money that we have. But we have let people get the idea that they are overtaxed. We have allowed people the idea, this little battle. Another mistake we made was Ballot Measure 3. You and I are paying something on the order of $82 million in tax refunds to federally retired people because you didn't pass something the legislature put on to deal with a contract that they had with the state retired people. And since a Supreme Court decision said state retirees and federal retirees have to be treated exactly the same, and we didn't pass that tax, the legislature's effort to enable that, we now have to refund this money to these federal employees. What bothers me about this is not that it's being done, but their attitude that it's their due. That somehow now that they have reached the magic age of 65, they are exempt from the responsibilities of citizenship. They're off duty now. The truth is, the graying of the United States and the graying of Oregon is moving faster than the rest of the country because people are moving here. They are becoming our increasing burden as well as one of our increasing economic contributors. Let's face it, the retired have saved Bandon. They have saved Brookings. You don't see them. They're saving this town too, but you don't see them because they represent a relatively small proportion. We don't see them really in Eugene either, but the smaller towns, they're very obvious people. They keep the retail business going while the rest of the money goes up and down with the economy. At the same time, they also form a burden. They are reluctant to share in the education of the next generation. Hey, they educated their kids. Why bother? The whole social gamut of, I mean, there is a layer, your social committee understands this because they dig into it, but there is a rather seamy part of our society that only CSD workers and the police and what have you look at. I mean, the Oregonian writes up the symptoms of this decay and the gang wars and what have you, but you never really get the full impact of the way these people are living. I don't think there's much to be done for that generation, but their children are in dire, dire trouble. And they will become the criminals and the welfare burden and the prison population of tomorrow unless we begin to intervene in their lives now. We're kissing off money to do that. Hey, that's not my problem. Let the next guy worry about it. Now, that's really what's bothering us, and there's nothing new sociologically about letting George do it. We've been doing that for years, and we just seem to be in a frenzy of it right now. We just do not want to accept our civic responsibility. I'm not sure I have an explanation for it. People like the standard of living they have. The post-World War II economic era, in which the United States dominated all the markets because the other markets had been decimated by the war, is clearly over. And our standard of living is becoming more like the rest of the world's, and many of us face downward mobility, and it is not a pleasant thought. My guess is that people who are facing downward mobility enjoy the way they now live and are doing what they can to cling on to the resources they've got to prevent it.
Next question? Here we go. Just a moment for Mr. Polani to reach the mic. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you. Thank you for waiting so patiently. I hope I won't disappoint you. I'm going to ask a transportation question.
Never, Ray, never.
Mr. Sadler, when will highway funding be subjected to the same kind of competitive scrutiny that everything else in publicly funded infrastructure will be?
Ray, as you all know, is the mass transit freak of the City Club. And a worthy position, that's not a put down. It has been a voice in the wilderness for a long time. Ray, I think that day is coming, and sooner than most people expect, simply because the cost of maintaining the present structure is extraordinary and enormous. We used to be able to nick the gas tax up 5 cents a year. We've done that for the past 4 or 5 years, and it is perpetuating the machine. But as the actual price of gas, less taxes begins to rise, we begin to hit an inelasticity. You will have noticed that the Oregon Traffic Safety Commission, always ready to take credit for anything, I mean, those folks are never happier than when they're threatening your license, has pronounced that one of the reasons that Oregon traffic accident fatalities went down last year was because gas prices went up and people are driving less. Well, what that tells me is that people can't afford to drive as much as they did. How much of that's pleasure and necessity, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is the inelasticity is probably setting in on the whole highway scheme. And we are probably not going to be able to massage prices the way we've been able to massage them in order to keep the gold-plated highway program going. Eugene faces this problem right now. We have a former mayor, Brian 8 Lanes Obie, who had a pitched battle with a new city councilman, Randy Let Them Ride Chinese-Made Bicycles McDonald. This is over the Ferry Street Bridge, which is one of our large East Side, West Side games like you have here. We can't survive 8 lanes on the Ferry Street Bridge dumping it into the arterials we have in downtown Eugene. And I doubt we're going to get everybody to abandon their automobiles for Chinese-made rental bicycles. Somewhere we've got to have something here. Came up I-5 this morning. We are crushing the asphalt lanes with these heavy trucks. And deregulation has made it possible to just throw more weight and more goods on more trucks and pound away. And the railroads, quietly rust. Are we going to spend the money? Policy decision, okay, when the time comes. We're approaching the time when from Salem South, we're going to talk about the third lane on each side of the freeway. Do we want to do that, or do we want to begin serious discussion about some people moving capacity up and down the valley and then on from Portland to Seattle? I mean, something other than Amtrak. okay? Something serious, something that moves almost as fast as the cars. Now, interestingly enough, the cars are slowing down. I have not lived in this town for 5 years now. And I can tell you, when I come here, the average speed at which I can drive around is considerably less than it was 5 years ago. This town's getting full. It's time for you to start looking at your whole car. Here's wisdom. You did the West Side Light Rail in the region. I mean, not every decision has been poor or bad. Okay, that's important, and we've done that. Now, whether the legislature will come up with a match remains to be seen. You'll see a lot of poor mouthing in the waiving of Measure 5. That's what I mean by this thing putting us all on hold. It doesn't matter whether it's just Polanyi's transportation or the human concerns. Everything in this state has been put on hold.
Chris Tobkin, City Club member. Russell, talk about the Republicans for a little minute, will you? What does it mean to have them in control of the House? What do you think they're up against, and how are they going to relate to a Democratic governor?
The Republicans continue to try to represent rural values in a state that is clearly urban. 2/3 of all the registered voters in this state live in 3 counties, Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas. 3/4 of all the registered voters in this state live in the Willamette Valley. That leaves all of eastern Oregon, the large chunk in southwestern Oregon, Medford, Ashland, Grants Pass, and the coast, to make up the remaining quarter. Oregon is not a rural state, and it hasn't been since the end of the war, the Second World War. Got to name your wars now. But change has occurred within the Republican Party, and you could see their effort to accommodate it by the choice of chairman of various committees. The Republicans are divided between the traditional Republican, Larry Campbell is one of them, I think, still searching for rural values. Republicans from Eastern Oregon who believe that any water that stays in a creek at irrigation time is wasted. It should be pumped out. There's one issue. Minimum stream flows is dead in the water if you've looked at the House Natural Resources Committee. Dead, 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 dead. 10 years of trying to get to there are gone now. But the other part of the Republican Party is a suburban contingent who are really no more different than the Democrats. They want money spent. They believe in spending money for public purposes. The only hitch is it has to be spent in their county. And I refer specifically to the Washington County delegation, for whom money spent in the Portland metropolitan area or at Portland State no longer appeases their appetite for money spent in the metropolitan area. It's got to be in Washington County. It is a new mouth to feed. Republicans are good soldiers. Unlike the Democrats, they don't air their laundry in public. You remember Will Rogers' famous line, "I'm not the member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat." The Republicans are organized. But it is clear to me from watching the appointments to the House committees that Larry Campbell was forced to make his peace with the suburban Republican, we will spend some money contingent. Delna Jones, Washington County, is the chairwoman of the Revenue Committee. Tony Van Vliet, college professor from Corvallis, chairs the House side of Ways and Means. Okay, there are very clearly some choices that were made by these suburban people. The Judiciary Committee had a fight between Randy Miller and Kelly Clark, both young bucks who really would like to be in the driver's seat. That was appeased by dividing the judiciary between the civil and criminal side and giving each of them the chairman of one. So Campbell has had to make his peace. Now what happens? Well, I'm not entirely sure. Larry Campbell comes to the Speaker's office as the most beholden Speaker of the House in modern times. For 10 years, he has been receiving tens of thousands of dollars from interest groups into his campaign to funnel to other House members in the hopes that eventually he could elect a majority. The majority would then work the will of the people who made the campaign contributions, and since the newcomers were beholden to Campbell, he'd get elected Speaker of the House. It's happened. The question is, whose agenda will the Republicans be following? The caucus? The party? Their own? Mr. Campbell's employer, Louisiana Pacific. I mean, it's yet to be seen, but it bears watching. This is not any normal transition in power.
We have time for one brief question.
Paul Parker, City Club member. The political energy that isn't being spent on dealing with Measure 5 is being spent on, in the Portland metropolitan area, is being spent on preparing for 500,000 extra people. Your very grim portrait of the effect of Measure 5 on the economy of Oregon suggests that there may be a real interaction between those two things. What do you predict, or you don't predict, what is your axiom regarding growth in the metropolitan area as a result of Measure 5?
Well, I think Portland has got to come to this gentleman's accurate description of the dynamics of what's going on. There is a renewed concern of growth, about its cost. I mean, what, in my opinion, propelled Measure 5 in the northwest part of the state was the cost of growth. Growth is expensive, and those who are here always subsidize facilities for the newcomers. So private investment will come in to accommodate the newcomers. That's the way it works. And if the tax burden gets too big, why, you start screaming about it. I have an unpopular suggestion. I think it is time, since the Portland area has reached the level, the critical mass necessary to generate its own economic development, that it seriously consider sharing some of these new plant locations with other parts of the state, where they could go and where they are needed. The prejudice in the other part of the state feels that the Department of Economic Development funnels all the money to Portland, all the requests to Portland, and sites them where they can, primarily because they're supported so much by the private utilities, and with the exception of the Portland metropolitan area, most of the other areas in this state are served by publicly owned utilities. Now, I've never found any evidence for that, but I want to tell you that's a very real feeling out there. There needs to be more sharing, particularly the Bend area, Ashland, Medford, and to some extent Eugene Springfield. Now, Eugene Springfield is on the verge of its own critical mass and imitating Portland. The real issue is, will we be up on the West Germany end of the high-tech economy we're building down there, or will we be at the low-tech Poland end of the economy? But you are going to be faced with accommodating 500,000 more people. Those are the projections. And I think one of your choices that you ought to seriously consider is saying no. Many interests would be served by spreading that population around. Transportation in California is cheaper than it is in Oregon because you can send full trucks from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and there's enough business down there to pick up a full load and bring it back to San Francisco. Okay? Trucks that leave the distribution centers in Portland almost entirely come back empty, even in the era of deregulation. This raises the cost of goods distributed from Portland and the rest of the state. If the population were spread out, these kinds of, dare I say the word, infrastructure costs, okay, are ameliorated, shared, evened, and the economy becomes infinitely more efficient. If the Portland area continues to grow at the expense of the rest of the state, and that's what's been happening the last 15 or 20 years, then you are going to have to live with the inefficiencies that come from being that very healthy center, okay, surrounded by an area you serve, and that is economically dependent on you. Now, it is not popular to come to this town and advocate the sharing of economic development and economic growth. But for those of you who are worried about the costs of growth, sharing that cost with the rest of the state is probably one of the most important things you can do to appease the taxpayers who were sufficiently angry to pass Ballot Measure 5 by a mere 42,000 votes. That was the last question. I want to tell you really two things. One is to thank you. To appear before this club once is a privilege. Twice is a distinction. I've had several more than that, and so I am indeed honored. The other is I want to publicly thank Nina Johnson, Chris Tobkin, and many of your previous staff members who have so unselfishly shared their time to help the City Club of Eugene get going. I don't know how many of you know your history, but your first motto in this club was harmony in diversity. Really, it was. That preceded the citizen of its community stuff that you have now.